Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary arteries of medieval life. Not royal bedrooms this time, but the docks, roads, and candlelit halls where a tiny stowaway rewrote the map of the world. Before we step into this hush of tolling bells and hurried prayers, do me a favor, tap like and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always wild seeing our little caravan stretch from Saigon to Stockholm to Sao Paulo. Okay, lights low. Maybe a fan or white noise app for that soft background hum. Blanket optional. Tonight we'll trace the Black Death, the way travelers once traced constellations on vellum. From windswept steppe to busy caravanserais. From siege-darkened ports to the sudden stillness of Messina in 1347. No jump scares, no gory visuals, just true history told with care, maps that glow, manuscripts that whisper, ships that arrive a little too quiet. We'll meet merchants who thought they were carrying silken stories, not fate, city councils that invented quarantine by sheer necessity, and families who learned that a season can change the shape of a century. If you're listening with headphones, let the lantern light in your imagination do the rest. Hear the rope creak against a quay. See the gold leaf catch on a monk's marginalia. Tiny skeletons dancing beside saints. A reminder, somber but strangely hopeful, that even in the shadow of catastrophe, people kept writing, trading, loving, rebuilding. That's our journey. Not horror for horror's sake, but clear-eyed wonder at how a world unraveled and then slowly, stubbornly, found new threads. Ready? Take a breath? Turn the page. Our first stop is a road of stars called the Silk Road, where a story too small to see began to move. Part 1. A candle in the dark. Lie back and picture a single candle in a stone-cold nave. Its flame trembles, as if it remembers something the books forgot to tell. Most of us were taught that the Black Death was a 4-year storm, 1347 to 1351, after which the clouds rolled back and Europe emerged, shaken but standing. Yet the candle knows better. The truth was not a single tempest, but a climate. A condition of life that returned and returned again like an unfinished sentence, like a bell tolled across generations. The people who lived through it did not speak of before and after the plague, as modern timelines do. They spoke of rumors traveling faster than riders, of doors shut quickly and quietly, of summers that felt shorter because grief lengthened the nights. They learned that catastrophe can be both sudden and patient, arriving in a rush, then lingering in memory, then reappearing just when rebuilding has begun. To grasp why the Black Death was worse than the tidy legend suggests, we must widen the frame. We must step away from cathedral squares and court records and listen to older roads. Watch caravans move like beads along a string, pulled tight between worlds. Hear rats scurry where ledgers are silent, and fleas ride in the seams of cloth where sermons cannot follow. We must start far from Europe's quays and clock towers. In a country of wind and grass where empires are only passing weather, the story you think you know is still here. Messina's harbour, Florentine chronicles, the sudden hush of Alexandria and Paris, but they are only chapters in a longer book. That book is about networks that made prosperity possible and thereby made calamity inevitable. About bodies already thinned by hunger and hearts already frayed by war. About how death, once a visitor, became a resident. Light the candle. We are going farther back and much farther out. Part 2. On the steppe, the seed before bells told in Europe a smaller sound, the dry click of a flea. In the open grasslands of Inner Asia, steppe as wide as breath, the bacterium Yersinia pestis kept its quiet kingdom. It lived in fleas that lived on wild rodents, marmots, gerbils, rats, and sometimes by paths unseen, in the cargo and bedding of people who believed they were only carrying grain and silk. For long ages, this was largely a local story, a circle kept by climate and distance. Then the world changed its shape. The Mongol conquests stitched together a domain from the Pacific to the gates of Europe. Ironically, the violence of making that empire produced afterward a new safety for travel. Under the Pax Mongolica, caravans crossed deserts under banners of protection. Toll gates opened, roads were maintained. Bandits vanished like dew at noon. With traders came poets and porcelain, spices and stories. Hand unwittingly, passengers too small to suspect. Caravanserais, roadside inns where animals were tied in courtyards and packs were stacked under eaves, became places where worlds touched. Imagine the scene at dusk. Hooves stilled, lanterns lit, kettles steaming. Men roll their blankets, rats nose through sacks. A single flea changes hosts, and the geography of tomorrow tilts. Records in China speak of terrible outbreaks decades before Europe had heard a whisper. Harvests failing from lack of hands. Towns diminished. Officials overrun by petitions they could not answer. The plague was never a purely European tale. It was pan-Eurasian. Central Asian nodes like Samarkand and Kashgar, Middle Eastern entrepôts, the ports of the Nile and Bosporus. Trade is a kind of spell that shortens distances. It binds fortunes, mingles tongues, and sometimes, when a tiny life rides a larger one, rearranges the fate of continents. The seed sown in the steppe would sprout on ships. Part 3. Caravans, crossroads, and the unseen passenger. Follow the Silk Road westward. Bales of cloth shift softly. Bronze buckles clink. A driver hums to keep the camels steady. In the half-sleep of the night watch, no one notes the little dramas unfolding beneath the lashings. A rat noses through millet, a flea leaps, a new reservoir is made. Caravanserais turned the march of miles into stages of rest and stages of spread. With every dawn the caravan rose, not knowing it carried more than profit. The plague did not move like a drumline, neat and audible. It travelled in ellipses, in silent arcs between hubs of exchange. The switch points of a globalizing world, oases, markets, toll plazas, were its launch pads. Chroniclers far to the east wrote of populations thinning, of local governments overwhelmed, of burying grounds that extended beyond the walls. These were not footnotes to Europe's later crisis. They were its prologue, an earlier act behind a curtain most Western stories seldom draw aside. This is the cruel logic of connection. The same roads that allow scholars' letters and spice caravans to shrink the world also permit a microbe to skip the queue of distance. We tend to remember the Renaissance's flowering, the way ideas and pigments and perspective techniques crossed land and sea. We forget that the arteries of that exchange were already pulsing a century earlier, and that their first common cargo of truly global consequence was fear. The caravan bells kept ringing. The maps kept tightening. The passenger none could see kept hitching a ride. Part 4. Siege and sail by the 1340s, the unwelcome traveller reached the northern coast of the Black Sea. At Kaffa, a Genoese trading port, a siege became infamous. Later accounts say besiegers, sickening themselves, hurled corpses over the walls. Whether or not that macabre detail happened as told, both besieged and besiegers suffered, and one truth is certain. Ships departing those harbours bore more than cargo. The sea, we like to think, is a border. Here it was a highway. Medieval vessels were floating pantries, grain in the hold, rope coiled like nested serpents, livestock sometimes penned on deck. Rats found everything they required. Once aboard, the disease could cut a crew down between one tide and the next. Rumour tells of ships sighted with sails slack and no answers called back. Vessels that drifted not with purpose, but with inertia, arriving at their destinations like letters from a hand already cold. In October 1347, Genoese ships limped into Messina, Sicily. What came ashore was not only silk or spice, but silence, the transforming hush when markets empty and neighbours avert their eyes. From Messina the routes spiderwebbed, Genoa and Venice, then Marseille and up the Rhone, across to Iberia, along the Adriatic, into the Balkans. Every famous port that had once been a gate to riches became, for a time, a hinge of misfortune. The Mediterranean, rather than moats between civilizations, proved to be their shared artery. Sailors unlashed hatches. Rats took options. Fleas tried every door. The continent's season changed in a single maritime month. Part 5. The hour the harbour fell speed was the plague's most harrowing trick. A town could feel normal on market day and be unrecognizable by the next. Doors barred, windows shuttered, the soundscape altered. Less hawking, more hurrying. Fewer greetings, more measured breaths. Ships drifting in with half their crew unable to stand became the era's most unsettling emblem. Even when officials tried to refuse entry, ropes were already moored, rats already finding their own way ashore. It is here that quarantine makes its debut, cities inventing waiting periods. a blunt instrument forged in panic and hope. The idea would mature, but at first it was no match for the tempo. Fear outran policy. Refugees, healthy, hopeful, terrified, left early and often, carrying with them the very stowaways they wished to escape. In some places, reaction became its own vector. The map of spread looks less like a firebreak and more like sparks on the wind. We are tempted to imagine containment as a possibility, as if a few sharper eyes at the key might have saved a nation. But the vectors were invisible. The logic of cause and effect lay beyond the medical thought of the age. To the witnesses, it seemed the air itself had soured, the heavens had inclined. They lacked our vocabulary, not their own senses. They saw what matters most, that life can change direction in a week, and that institutions built for ordinary storms falter in extraordinary weather. Part 6. What the body recorded. The body became a ledger written in a script people could read but not amend. Aches, fever, swellings in hidden folds and tender hinges, signs that felt like the night placing a hand on the shoulder at noon. Some coughed and worsened swiftly, their breath the hardest labor of all. Others sank into stupors that made even whispering a task. Patterns emerged, one form that lived in lymph and skin, another that hunted lungs. Yet to those without microscopes it was one thing only, an omen that darkened in hours. Healers tried what they had, balances adjusted by bloodletting, strong scents to sweeten what they believed was bad air, poultices and prayers. Their intention was earnest. Their tools were wrong. So the guardians of health became proof of helplessness, and households learned a discipline of distance. Many cared for one another at cost. Many could not or dared not. The details that modernity would label had names only in metaphor then, and the metaphors were all winter. We will not linger on gore. The lesson is larger. This was a quickening. From the first signs to the last, time folded. Lives that had counted in seasons were suddenly reckoned in days. Communities had no chance to adapt, to build routines of mercy. The result was a strange theater, every street a stage where the cast changed daily, every home a rehearsal for decisions that no one felt ready to make. The body recorded the drama faithfully. The sciences that might annotate it would be born much later. Part 7. The census of absence. How many were lost? The numbers themselves seemed to dim the lamps, a third across the continent, and in some places near half, not evenly but intensely, in bursts that erased villages from tax rolls and parish books. In England, entire settlements slipped from the registers, no mistake of the clerk, but a silence in the fields. In Italy, Florence and Venice, engines of art and trade slowed as if a millstone had fallen into their gears. In France, the universities thinned, and the clergy dwindled so fast that ordinations were hurried through with sad efficiency. Beyond Europe, the tally was no less grave. Cairo, a jeweled capital, saw its numbers sink. Damascus recorded prayer after prayer as burial grounds extended. The Mediterranean spoke one language in those years, fewer voices. What makes this ledger so hard to hold is the compression of time. Not a slow diminishing over decades, but a falling away within seasons. To count by thirds and halves is to forget that each fraction was a face, and each face a family. The arithmetic of disaster is never only arithmetic. The census of absence wrote itself into landscapes. Barns untended, vineyards unpruned, guild halls quieter than they had been in living memory. Bells that had rung for feast days took on a different task and then fell still for lack of ringers. Records break off mid-entry, as if the quill itself had heard a knock and never returned. Centuries later, we touch those parchments and feel the pause. Part 8. The fever of crowds' panic has its own repertoire. Some turned inward, doors sealed, smoke curling under lintels to cleanse the air, charms worn until the cords frayed. Some turned outward, seeking patterns in the sky or blame in their neighbors. Bands of penitents crossed town squares in choreographed sorrow, believing that pain offered publicly might persuade heaven. Others spread rumors that cruelly targeted Jewish communities, falsehoods about wells and malice, leading to persecutions that history condemns and mourns. Markets emptied even where illness had not yet arrived, because fear is a forecast that alters the weather. Quacks appeared, selling assurances in bottles and rings. Bonfires blazed in streets to purify what could not be seen. Funeral rites, Normally, a village's most tender choreography were shortened or skipped, not from indifference but from arithmetic and fear. This is not a new lesson, but it is a fresh one each time. In crisis, imagination doubles as both refuge and accelerant. The tools of belief and custom can console, and can also, when turned the wrong way, wound. The period's most honest chroniclers do not gloat or scold. They record and grieve. Their sentences hold two truths at once: that human beings search for meaning in every tremor, and that not every meaning we seize will save us. Part 9. Offices without voices, institutions are made of people, and people were falling. Priests who were meant to comfort at bedsides were called most often to the places of greatest risk. Many died there, others fled in fear, leaving altars unvisited and bells untended. Physicians, trained within the limits of their day, watched. Remedies fail, and either retreated to patrons' houses or took their leave from the work. Magistrates found their benches empty, dockets unargued because litigants were gone. In the archives you can see authority evaporate. A clerk's neat script halts mid-case. Minutes note a council unable to meet for want of a quorum, not because politics paused, but because breath did. Families the final net frayed. Some held fast and paid dearly for the holding. Others closed doors on their own kin in fear and despair. The impression is of a scaffolding shaken until the boards loosened. Where once there was a lattice of roles and rituals, there stood gaps you could see daylight through. Across cultures the pattern rhymed. In Avignon the papal court staggered. In London lawyers vanished from chambers. In cities of the Mamluk and later Ottoman worlds, judges and imams similarly thinned. Rank offered no truce. Offices fell quiet, not because laws were repealed or doctrines reversed, but because the voices that spoke them were missing. Part 10, no after, only again. The most sobering truth is cyclical. The first wave was not the last. In the 1360s and then again and again outbreaks returned. England felt a rhythm of roughly a decade. London alone would weather scores of major recurrences before the 17th century. Italian ports always connected, built lazarettos on offshore islands, and enforced 40-day waits for ships. Quarantines that slowed the tide but could not cancel the moon. Across the Middle East and North Africa, the same alternation, normal seasons punctured by seasons of loss, became familiar. The Mediterranean's gift is connection. Its tax in those centuries was exposure. Children grew up with lullabies touched by caution. Adults planned apprenticeships and harvests with an unspoken if hovering in the room. It is difficult to repair trust in institutions and neighbors when, unpredictably, a new season asks for the shovels again. The result was not permanent collapse, but permanent provisionality. Communities learned to live with a horizon that could move overnight. They revised calendars, expanded cemeteries, wrote regulations of public health that would one day become the bones of modern practice. But the unease remained, the knowledge that the wheel could spin without warning, and that no coast or creed had a private treaty with mercy. Part 11, a stage set for ruin. Why did the plague cut so deeply? Because it arrived in a century already wounded. In 1315-1317, relentless rains drowned Europe's granaries. The Great Famine left bodies smaller and reserves thinner. The scars lasted decades. Add to this the 100 Years' War. Countrysides plundered, towns besieged, populations on the move seeking safety with what belongings they could carry. Refugees pack a city faster than officials can count them. Vermin learn new addresses immediately. Sieges were catastrophic multipliers. Crowded walls, short rations, fear that made every choice desperate. Soldiers, quartermasters, and camp followers shared close quarters where cleanliness was a pious wish. And beyond the famous conflict, Italy's city-state feuds, imperial entanglements in the German lands, and incursions and rebellions farther east kept populations shifting. The stage was dressed sadly for disease, hunger, crowding, motion. People noticed the pattern without seeing the mechanism. They wrote that war brings pestilence, that hunger invites sickness, that God must be displeased with human cruelty. Their theology named what their science could not. The numbers confirm the intuition. Where famine had bitten deepest, mortality was often worse. Where war had churned the land, spread was faster. The arch of catastrophe, in other words, was already built. Plague became its keystone. Part 12. When work went silent. After the first shock, a different silence rolled in, the silence of empty workshops and idle furrows. Labor shortages were immediate and profound. Wages rose in places where workers could bargain. Tenants asked for better terms. Mobility increased as the living chose where to lend their hands. Legislators tried to nail the wind. In England, the Statute of Labourers, 1351, sought to cap pay and hold people to old obligations. Resentment simmered. In 1381, it boiled over in the Peasants' Revolt. Skills vanished with masters who had not yet taught apprentices. Some cathedrals paused for lack of stonecraft. Some guild secrets evaporated between one winter and the next. Land use changed shape. Marginal fields reclaimed in times of plenty drifted back to pasture. Sheep multiplied, and the cloth trade's importance swelled. This was not only an economic pivot, but a cartographic one. Maps of livelihoods were redrawn by subtraction. Families, too, were redrafted. Inheritance jumped odd branches when heirs were gone. Lineages thinned or ended. Marriages reknotted the social web with unusual speed. Governments counted fewer taxpayers, even as they sought funds for war and rebuilding. The old order did not disappear, but it creaked. And the creaks taught a new music, that power is not absolute when the field hands can choose another field, and that communities are ecosystems where losing a single species, say, master masons, changes the whole forest. Part 13, the theatre of death, and of life culture absorbed the blow and answered in the language it knows, images, stories, song, and stone. On church walls and cemetery cloisters, the danse macabre appeared. Skeletons hand in hand with kings and bakers, bishops and brides, reminding all that the grave levels rank. Manuscripts that had once filled margins with playful beasts made room for skulls and hourglasses, not as morbid decorations but as moral grammar. Memento mori. Remember you must die. Writers set their tales against a backdrop of escape and remembrance. Boccaccio's storytellers, for instance, fleeing Florence to speak of love and wit in a world newly conscious of brevity. Ossuaries stacked bones in careful order. Bells taught towns to hear absence as a note in the civic scale. Music bent toward lament, then slowly found its way back to joy, always with a shadow at the edge. This fixation did not smother life. Paradoxically, it sharpened it. The Renaissance's luminous attention to the human figure and the tangible world makes a different kind of sense when seen after centuries that looked over their shoulders at the open door. To paint a living body with such tenderness is to confess that the painter knows what time can do. So the candle at the start burns on, smaller perhaps, but steadier. The Black Death was a demographic calamity, an economic convulsion, and, most lastingly, a psychological and cultural rupture. It did not come and go. It visited and returned. It edited institutions and imaginations alike. Generations learned a double lesson, that mortality is universal and that meaning can be made in the face of it. We live downstream of those lessons. We inherit their cautions and their courage.